Hello everyone, quick discussion on diarrhea, lovely topic this week. It's something we see a lot of, and we seem to have seen an awful lot of it recently. And there's some common misconceptions about it, so I thought I'd do a quick overview of the whole topic. So diarrhea, what is diarrhea? Well, we've all got our visions of what diarrhea is, but essentially it's that sloppy, non-formed poo, or stools as we call them. Sorry, there's going to be a lot of chat about poo in this video. So yes, essentially really sloppy, and it comes as a variety of colours and various things like that. But diarrhea as a whole, we're talking about that sloppy stool that comes out of them. So why is it sloppy? Well, I suppose the most obvious thing to say is it's got a high water content. So from this, we can actually start to extrapolate quite a lot. If it's got a high water content, why has it got a high water content? So the way the gut normally works is that things go in the top, stuff comes out the bottom, quite literally. During that time, everything kind of gets churned up like a washing machine in there. Fluids that you drink, fluid from the food, saliva all gets mixed together. And when I operate on dogs that have got stuff stuck, it doesn't matter whether on a wet or a dry food, the stuff that's in the small intestines, and remember we go from the esophagus down to the stomach, then down to the small intestines, duodenum, jejunum, ileum, and then into the large intestine, and then out. So when I operate on these dogs, what I tend to find is that we in the small intestine you get like a brown slurry type material. So it's not hard, it's not soft. It's almost like I don't know how you describe it really. It's like a very runny brown paste going through, and that's a combination of all that fluid and food mixing together. And in the normal dog, what would happen was, as that goes through the small intestine, vitamins, minerals, nutrients, so carbohydrates, fats, proteins, etc., would all be absorbed from the gut, and then it moves into the large intestine. Now, in the large intestine, what we commonly find is that more vitamins and minerals are absorbed there, not many carbohydrates or fats or proteins at that point. But one of the primary functions of your large intestine, your colon, is actually to recover that water back into the body. So the colon will actually draw water out of the slurry that's going through it. And as it goes along the colon, it gradually becomes more and more like a poo. So it's drawing the water out. Now, what we commonly find with diarrhea is that water hasn't been drawn out. So why would that be? Well, perhaps for some reason the small intestine isn't doing its job properly, and there's an awful lot of very watery ingesta, as we call it, coming through into the large intestine. And the large intestine is completely overwhelmed, and it tries to take some out, but it doesn't take it all out. Or perhaps the large intestine is very inflamed, and so it can't get the water out of that ingesta, and so it all just comes out the rear end. Or perhaps there's another problem, if we think of something like cholera, or, in dogs, parvovirus, where actually you can get water being secreted into the intestines, which adds to the diarrhea. Or perhaps the dog has eaten something which naturally draws water into the feces, something called an osmotic diarrhea forming issue. Now, that's less common than the first two. I'd say the first two, inflammation, are the most common, followed by something like, something that actively secretes water, and then these osmotic diarrhea problems. So let's go back to the two most common causes. So inflammation in the guts causing this diarrhea issue. Anything that causes inflammation in the large intestine or the small intestine can therefore have the potential to cause diarrhea. So by things that cause inflammation, we're looking at bacteria, viruses, not so much fungi, that sort of thing, perhaps, certain types of diffuse cancers, toxins that they've ingested as opposed to poisons. By toxins, I mean something that actively irritates the inside of the gut, or food allergies or intolerances. So again, something that they essentially can't cope with in their gut causes this inflammation, and you get all this inability of the gut to withdraw water from the ingesta going through. It's really, really important when we look at diarrhea to think about what are the signs, how often is it happening? How urgent is it? Is there anything else with it? So for instance, small intestinal diarrhea, as it comes cascading through into the large intestine, tends to then be held by the large intestine until it all comes out. So we tend to find that with that kind of diarrhea, it is less frequent during the day because the large intestine can actually hold on to it until they go out for a poo. With large intestinal diarrhea, what we tend to find is that intestine's so inflamed that it can't hold on to that very watery ingesta, and so it just comes out randomly. And so with large intestinal diarrhea, we find that the diarrhea tends to happen quite regularly through the day. There's often a great deal of urgency with it as well. Other things that we can look at: blood. So red blood in the diarrhea tends to indicate a problem in the large intestine, because if there's bleeding in the small intestine, as the blood comes down, it gets digested and it actually comes out as sort of like little black granules. Those little black granules, or sometimes we find completely black diarrhea, we call melena. Melena is one of the old four humours, vital humours, black humour. Not very nice at all. They thought it was the evil coming out. So yeah, red blood versus black blood or dark blood can tell us where in the gut that this is happening. Other things that we can look at, is there a jellified substance on it? Is there gut lining being shed at the same time? That would give us an idea. Is it in combination with vomiting? Because the stomach, the small intestine and the large intestine, they're all part of the GI tract. So if we're seeing vomiting and we're also seeing urgent diarrhea with perhaps a little bit of red blood in, we know that the whole GI tract is inflamed at that point. So we've got gastritis, meaning inflammation of the stomach. We've got enteritis, which is inflammation of the small intestine. And we've got colitis as well, inflammation of the colon at the other end. So we can start to put together a picture from the history, essentially where this problem is. Does it matter? Ultimately, does it matter? Well, yes and no. The cause of diarrhea is actually really very rarely ever found, especially in sort of acute diarrhea that gets better in a couple of days, because these things just tend to get better on their own. The virus is cleared, or the toxin that they've ingested as the horrible manky bird has made its way out the rear end, etc., etc. So we never get to the bottom of it. So we end up symptomatically treating these dogs or cats. So we look at maybe giving them something like metronidazole or oxytetracycline, something that's a direct anti-inflammatory within these things are antibiotics, but they also have an anti-inflammatory effect within the gut. Or we may well feed them, something that will absorb the water and help them to have a more formed stool coming out of the rear end. So a full as earth type thing. So they often have these sort of diarsenal, those sort of thing, or logic diarrhea pastes. They don't particularly have any functional component apart from just holding the poo together. We can do other things as well. One of the major effects of diarrhea is obviously lots of water is leaving the gut, and so you can get dehydration. So we might want to rehydrate them, and with rehydration we look at plain water isn't enough really. You need a little bit of salt and ideally a bit of sugar in there as well, so you can get made up electrolyte type things. Or you can actually, there are WHO, World Health Organization recipes where you just get sugar, salt, water, add it all together, and that's a really effective rehydrator. Or even, something like flat Coke. Sounds crazy, but really good at rehydrating them. So yeah, in terms of the actual cause, perhaps not so important, but we look at the symptom and try and alleviate that, and try and alleviate the issue that it causes, which is dehydration. And with that comes problems with the immune system, because the immune system becomes stressed, and then it can all become a little bit of a rolling problem. In the worst case scenario, you have a dog or a cat that's really dehydrated. They could go into what we call pre-renal failure, so it can start to affect the kidneys. In more long-term type diarrheas, there is a case for trying to work out what's going on, and the major way we do that is with a fecal sample, and we look for things like Campylobacter, Giardia. We look for oocysts for coccidiosis. We can look for things like Trichomonas in young cats, Trichomonas fetus, lots of different things like that. So, we tend to do a panel to try and establish exactly what's going on there. Some of the viruses which cause problems, we actually need to look for the viral DNA. So we need to do something called PCRs, polymerase chain reactions, which amplifies the amount of DNA of the virus in the poo to try and find it. So there are a few different things that we can do. One of the things that we always recommend at that point is, because certain problems are only found, so say you've got a Campylobacter or a Giardia, the organism's within the gut, but it isn't being shed in the feces continually. It is shed intermittently. So you may well find that on the Monday it's shed, the Tuesday it isn't shed, and then the Wednesday it comes out in the feces, in the diarrhea. This can make life a little bit tricky, because if you then get one fecal sample on that Tuesday, you don't find the organism. So they can be a little bit insensitive. So what we generally recommend is we get 3 fecal samples, and what we'll do here is we'll mush them all together. It's not the nicest job in the world, and then we send them off to the laboratory, and then the laboratory can try and find the potential organisms from that. Sometimes we find organisms which are in there which don't seem to cause any issues. So there are dogs out there who are absolutely fine, and when you take a fecal sample, they've got odd Campylobacter in there, but it's not causing an issue. So just because we find it in a dog that potentially has diarrhea doesn't necessarily mean that is the underlying cause. It might be an aggravating factor, but it's not necessarily the underlying cause. So yeah, I think with regards to food intolerant diarrhea, generally you see vomiting along with that as well. And by intolerance, I mean sort of like your glutens, to wheat, that sort of thing, rather than actual distinct food allergies. And the only way to diagnose them would be to put them onto a hypoallergenic diet, one that's been specially treated so it can't cause allergies within the gut, for 6 weeks with no other treats, just water alongside that, and see if that helps things. So there you go, diarrhea. It's more interesting than you might think.